Um, all right. Well, thank you for taking the time. First question is, this has been quite an emotional week for a lot of people. And my thoughts in bringing you here today to interview you is to talk about, what's happened with George Floyd over the past week. So just kind of wanted to get your thoughts on everything that's gone on this week. I know that's a lot, but
Yeah, there's a
um,
lot that's happened.
yeah, exactly. But just kind of, get your impressions and thoughts on how things have gone on this week.
Yeah. All right. So I think we can identify maybe three different categories there. The first is the actual incident itself, the arrest and killing of George Floyd. Uh, the second are the factors that may have contributed to the arrest and killing of George Floyd. That is what led up to that. And the third is what came after that, the protests, and particularly for my area of expertise, the police response to the protests, which are unfortunately just the most recent example of nationwide protests of perceived police abuses. So I'm not sure what order you want to take those in, and I don't just want to unleash a flood of editorial content. So,
Yeah.
and any, like you tell me what you want to
All
talk
right.
about, and
Sure.
I'll see
Well,
what
I
we can
mean,
talk about.
let's kind of first start off with the incident that happened, the kind of interaction between the police and George Floyd, and before we get into the kind of protest and the outcry that has happened this week, like how do we even get to that position where a police officer has a knee on someone's neck, and there are other officers around him who are complicit in a way, who haven't made any suggestion that he says he cannot breathe and he cannot get up. How do we get there?
Yeah, good question. And I think the easiest way to approach that is exactly the framework you suggest. Start with the incident and then look backwards to see how it happened. First, I think at this point everyone has seen that video, the set of videos now about that interaction, and watching that. One of the first things that struck me was just how incredibly and how obviously painfully inappropriate it was. And I don't just mean in the casual sense of cops shouldn't treat someone like that. I mean in the very technical sense. Police training has emphatically rejected exactly what these officers did in different ways. So my co-authors and I recently wrote a book called Evaluating Police Uses of Force, and we have an op-ed in the Washington Post that identifies four critical and well-known failures that we see in this interaction. The first is the first and really the most important, although it's slightly less obvious than the knee on the neck, is keeping Mr. Floyd in that face down position while he's handcuffed for so long. It's been well known in policing since at least the 1990s, mid 90s, that keeping someone in that position, because it puts a lot of stress on the chest, a lot of weight on the chest and abdomen, it makes it difficult to breathe, and it can contribute to something referred to as positional asphyxia. Essentially, someone can breathe even enough to gasp or to talk, but they aren't getting the oxygen they need, and that can asphyxiate them. And even if it doesn't asphyxiate them, the difficulty breathing and the stress it puts on the body can cause other problems, including cardiac arrest. I am not an expert. I'm not a doctor. I'm not an expert in that area, so I can't really speak to the physiological mechanisms there. What I can speak to as an expert in policing and police training is that we've known about the risks. 1995, the National Institute of Justice put out a report saying, hey, maybe don't do this. And police training since has observed, often in the aftermath of incidents like this, that when officers apprehend someone, if they have them in that face down position while handcuffed, they should, as soon as the situation allows, put them into what policing refers to as a recovery position by rolling them onto their side, sitting them up, or having them stand. So critical error number one, keeping him in that position. Critical error number two was putting weight on him, and particularly on the back of his neck while he's in that position. The bystander, not the long video, but the shorter one, an 18-second video, shows multiple officers kneeling on Mr. Floyd's back. Of course, that adds to the difficulty breathing. The knee across the neck actually introduces another problem, though. If you think about what happens when you lay down, your chest and your head or your face touch the ground. But that means if this is the ground, that means your neck doesn't touch the ground. It's suspended, kind of like a bridge. So if you put, or if officers put a great deal of weight on the back of someone's neck, it can damage their cervical spine. It can break what's called the hyoid bone, which is a bone behind the trachea, and that can be a fatal injury. So separate and apart from the risks of positional asphyxia, we know not to put knees on necks. In fact, not only do we talk about this in our book, but I have sitting open for me right now a book published by Caliber Press, which is one of the country's biggest police training providers and also the biggest police-oriented publisher. And let's see, right there, it says in capital letters, do not put your knee on the suspect's neck or spine. Right?
Yeah.
So this is not new information. It happened anyway. That's two. The third critical error is the officers didn't appear to check Mr. Floyd's welfare. We know that officers have a moral, a professional, and a legal obligation to ensure the safety and well-being of individuals they've taken into custody. So the fact that the responding medics did not know that Mr. Floyd had lost consciousness until they arrived is absolutely unconscionable. Not only should officers have gotten him out of that position, but they should have been checking his breathing and his pulse and rendering aid to the extent that they can. The fourth critical factor is the failure of other officers to intervene. The criminal complaint that the prosecutor filed to charge Derek Chauvin with murder in the third degree says that other officers did say something. They suggested getting him upright, but that they didn't do anything else. That Chauvin said, no, we're going to keep him right here, and no one challenged that. Unfortunately, policing as a cultural norm has made it very difficult for one officer to criticize another officer, particularly when that officer is in charge of the scene, and especially when that officer is of higher rank or has more experience, has more years on the job than the other officers. But it is absolutely essential that when officers see another officer doing something wrong, that they step in, say something, and do something. It has to be a cornerstone of police culture. And some agencies have done that. The New Orleans Police Department has a program called EPIC, Ethical Policing is Courageous, that puts peer intervention at the core of officer culture, not just to help protect community members, but also to prevent fellow officers from making what can be career-ending mistakes. So the quick summary there is 4 critical errors, all of which may have contributed and appear to have, based on the information that we have right now, appear to have contributed to Mr. Floyd's death. So the big question is, how did they happen, right? If we've known for 25 years that officers shouldn't have someone in that position, why was he in that position for more than 8 minutes? If we've known not to put weight on someone's neck, why was his knee on somebody's neck? If we've known that officers have to intervene, why didn't they intervene? And here's where my answer breaks down a little bit. I don't know whether these individual officers, these 4 officers, were grossly incompetent or just did not care about proper policing. I'm not sure. Either is possible. I'm also not sure, without more information than I currently have, what kind of systemic factors may have contributed to these officers being either incompetent or indifferent about about proper police procedure. If the officers, I have a very, very difficult time believing that the officers hadn't been trained better than they demonstrated, particularly because in 2013, the Minneapolis Police Department paid out a $3 million settlement to the family of a man who was killed in substantially the same circumstances. And at the time, the agency said it was providing training to all officers on how not to do what these officers ultimately did to Mr. Floyd. So I have a hard time believing it's training. And it's probably not policy, because I don't think, under my review of the agency policies, that what the officers did was clearly permitted by the policy. So if it's not training and it's not policy, what is it? Well, training and policy only matter if they're enforced. And that means it might be a matter of supervision. If this is something that officers did all the time that either wasn't being identified or wasn't being corrected, that's a supervisory issue. And then we have even broader, we have the legal framework that makes it very difficult in many cases for officers to be investigated, disciplined, or terminated. We have a legal framework that can make it very difficult for officers to be sued. We have both legal and practical frameworks that make it difficult for officers to be criminally prosecuted, even for fairly egregious actions. I'm not a big believer in saying that every officer who makes any mistake should be criminally charged. I think we tend to overuse criminal justice as a response to a whole range of social problems. But surely when you have egregious actions, they deserve criminal punishment. Unfortunately, for both legal and pragmatic reasons, that can be pretty difficult.
So when this kind of situation happens in a police department, and police officers return to station or whatever, and the report comes to the desk of the chief. I don't know how that process works, but once an issue, because the police chief in Minneapolis, he fired them pretty quickly.
He did.
And so what are the steps, and what is the conversation that's had within a police department to, first of all, understand that something went wrong, and then to try and either correct that or say, you need to go?
Yeah, good question. It's going to depend a lot on from agency to agency, which is actually part of the problem, or at least part of what makes it really difficult to understand. We have 18,000 police agencies in the United States. 15,000 of them are city or county police departments, and they can do things very, very differently. A lot of the agencies, in fact, almost half of the agencies, about 47 or 48%, have less than 10 officers. So the processes that they have may look very different than the process in place at a larger agency like Minneapolis or Chicago or LA. What I would expect to happen normally is the officers do a report, and the supervisor reviews the report and any accompanying evidence, maybe body camera footage or the like. The supervisor, the frontline supervisor, that is the officer's immediate supervisor, the sergeant, usually a sergeant, although that's also going to depend on agency, signs off on it and sends it up to the next level, where it goes to, say, a lieutenant. They sign off on it, and then maybe it goes up to another level. So it usually reports have to get approved, what's called up the chain of command. When you have a serious use of force, or a death in custody, or an officer-involved shooting, as they're called, or something like that, then other processes come into play. You might have use of force investigators or internal affairs investigators respond to the scene. You might have a series of very formal procedural protections or requirements that come into play. That's going to depend on the union contract, the contract that exists between the police union and the city, that may limit who can interview the officer and when the officer can be interviewed, and whether the officer has to be shown some or all of the evidence that they're going to be questioned about before the interview, for example. There's a fair amount of variation there. Some states have laws that limit or shape how officers are investigated. Almost every collective bargaining agreement, that is the contract between the union and the agency, the police union and the city or county, has disciplinary protections or procedures in it. One of the big questions I think we should pay attention to is whether these officers, who, as you say, were very quickly fired from the Minneapolis Police Department, whether using some of these disciplinary grievance procedures or arbitration procedures, they're going to be able to get their jobs back at that agency. Or even if not, whether they're able to get rehired at another police agency doing the same job under someone else's badge.
Okay. So I think now, like, kind of still continuing along this kind of trajectory chronologically going.
Sure.
So now we've seen a week of widespread protests across the country, some peaceful, some more violent, and the conversation around race and policing has escalated a lot. My question to you is now, like, so first let's talk about communities around the country, communities that were not involved in Minneapolis, but still are feeling what has been felt in Minneapolis. Now, police systems and communities feel like that they have police have to rebuild that trust with the community, because they feel like the community feel like they've lost it with the police, or vice versa. How do you even start to kind of rebuild that trust with the community? And this is the second part of my question is, we have, anti-bias training as one measure or one solution in which some police departments will take. But what kind of things do we have in place that are actually effective right now in helping, create better relationships between communities of color and police forces?
Yeah, really good question. And while police uses of force or violence have not been directed exclusively at people of color, they certainly have been directed disproportionately at people of color. That's unfortunately true across the board. We know that from social science research, economists like Richard Fryer at Harvard, who found that although in his study there was no discrepancy in lethal force, there was a significant discrepancy in less lethal force. We know from surveys by the Bureau of Justice Statistics that Blacks particularly report officers threatening or using violence almost 3 times as often as whites report officers threatening or using violence. So there is a discrepancy here, right? And understanding it is really the first step of stamping it out. Unfortunately, we don't fully understand it. And I want to make that point before I answer your questions. We don't fully understand it because we don't track as a country the type of data that would be necessary to understand it. Until relatively recently, we had crap information about police shootings, the most highly visible, most impactful use of force. And we didn't know much about them. The FBI had one set of numbers, the CDC had another set of numbers, and it turns out that when private media groups like Washington Post or The Guardian started using public source aggregation techniques, they found that both the FBI and the CDC were way off, right? Instead of there being 600 or 400 officer-involved fatalities every year, there were about 1,000 every year. And that number has held steady for, the last 5 years or so that we've collected that data. It is embarrassing in a first world country that the best data we have about police officers killing people comes from private media organizations. We don't even have that much data on less severe force options. And those are really the ones that are more important. Officers shoot people, and we can estimate about how often they shoot every year, even without fatalities. But a police shooting is inherently anomalous. They just don't happen that often in proportion to the more than 60 million police interactions every year. If you really want to understand the texture of American policing, I think it's more important to look at how often officers slap someone or take them to the ground or hold them down, right? That's going to give us a much better understanding of what police use of force really looks like on the ground than shootings. Okay, to answer your question, what can agencies do to restore or maybe to get that trust in the first place, particularly in communities that haven't had it? And on the one hand, I have some very precise or at least discrete answers for you. On the other hand, they're nothing new, right? Um, every time there's been, well, not every time, often when there's been some massive failure of policing, some elected official has put together a blue panel commission to study what happened. Uh, most recently, we've had the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. That was formed in 2014 or 2015, and their final report issued in 2015. But we've also had the Kerner Commission, the Christopher Commission, the Mullen Commission, all the way back, and I'm only mentioning a couple of them, all the way back to the Wickersham Commission in 1933, that talked about the failure of policing during Prohibition. And what's startling when you line up these reports is how many of them are making very similar comments. They're identifying very similar problems. They're suggesting very similar solutions. The problem is not that we don't know what to do. The problem is that we have lacked the political will, that elected officials specifically have not committed time, resource, or political capital to actually implementing some of the things that we have known how to do. All right, so how can we do it? First and foremost, trust building starts small in every interaction between every officer and every member of the public, whether that's responding to a cat in a tree or a child who won't go to school or a shoplifting arrest or a forged check, as in Mr. Floyd's case. Officers will have adversarial encounters and they will use force quite legitimately on a number of occasions. But officers should still look at every situation as providing the potential, the opportunity to leave the individuals they interact with a better impression of them and their agency and policing than those individuals had before the interaction. There's research by Brian Landy, a PhD and police officer who had a big DARPA grant to study strategic social interactions. And he found that one of the hallmarks of successful interactions was officers or soldiers, he studied both, going in with this attitude of viewing the interaction as a trust-building opportunity, right? Okay, so that's one. Two, we need to remember that trust building, that needs to start like 5 years before you have a critical incident. It is way too late in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd for agencies to hold a town hall meeting, have some community leaders come in and try and calm things down. If agencies and officers haven't been putting in that work day in and day out for years in advance, then they are not going to have the foundation of trust that they need to avoid catastrophe. There's a quote that I like. I think it's from one of the guys at Under Armour, although I'm not sure. So maybe I shouldn't have said that at all. But he said, trust is gained in drops and lost in buckets. And the way that I think about it is people are not reacting just to George Floyd's death, right? George Floyd's death was the spark. It was the match thrown down. And when it landed on this pile of gasoline-soaked wood. So when an agency reaches for its bucket to put out that fire, if you don't have your little droplets of trust in there, if that bucket's dry, you have nothing to work with to put that fire out. On the other hand, if you have trust, then maybe you can put that fire out. And if you have enough trust, maybe that wood isn't quite so gas soaked, right? Maybe that spark doesn't take light. And we've seen this in areas around the country, like Camden in New Jersey. Oh boy, where else? In Michigan, I apologize, names are escaping me. In places where the police agency has built up over time enough trust that when the police chief goes to a protest and says, my officers and I want to walk with you because what happened was unfair. And we need to express that. We need to be here for you, the community members. They are welcomed into that protest and not viewed as an occupying force, right? So we know that trust is essential. We know it helps keep community members and officers safe. We also know that you got to do it every day. Okay, what else can they do? I mean, there are a bunch of things that can be done, but that agencies either don't always want to do, or that elected officials are often too cowardly to get done. They don't have the political will to get done. There are laws that could be changed. For example, there's a concept, a legal doctrine called qualified immunity, which makes it very difficult to sue officers civilly for damages. We can get in the details if you like, but one of the easy, well, not easy, but one of the straightforward legislative fixes, Congress, federal legislature, could pass a statute that either restricts or eliminates qualified immunity. At the federal level, we could also do a lot more for data gathering initiatives. And we could put much more resources into the Department of Justice, the office in the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Enforcement, that investigates police agencies for patterns and practices of unconstitutional conduct. The Department of Justice can't investigate 18,000 police agencies, but it can, through its COPS office, the Community-Oriented Policing Office, it can offer technical assistance, it can provide policy assistance to agencies. Unfortunately, this administration cut a significant amount of COPS funding, right? So Congress could tell the Department of Justice, we want you to be doing more in this space. At the state level, we could have better use of force laws. More than half, actually about 3/4 of use of force laws in the country are simply outdated, right? They were, let me rephrase that. Many of them are outdated. About 3/4 of them were passed in or before the 1970s, and many of them have not been substantively amended since then. Washington State and California recently amended their use of force laws, so we know that there is a legislative path forward to that. But a number of states still have very permissive or very nebulous use of force laws. There are still 5 states in the country that allow officers to use deadly force to prevent the escape of a fleeing felon, a rule that the Supreme Court said was not consistent with the Fourth Amendment, for example. So 1, amend state use of force laws. 2, amend police certification and decertification regimes. Almost all the states certify police officers. In order to serve as an officer, you need to have a certificate, a professional license. Many of the states don't do very much to actually police those licenses, though. So since about the 1960s, according to Roger Goldman, the national expert on this at the St. Louis University School of Law, there have been about 30,000 officers who've had their certifications taken away, who've been decertified so they can't work in that state as an officer again. But 3 states, North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia, make up about half of those decertifications. And it's not because officers in those states are any worse than other states. It's because those states happen to have active decertification regimes. In some states, you can't decertify an officer unless they are criminally convicted, right? Convicted of a crime. In some states, you can't decertify an officer unless they are convicted of a felony or a select group of serious misdemeanors. So we could do a lot more to address problem officers. That would also prevent a problem called wandering officers, which are officers who are either fired from one agency or who resign in lieu of being fired and then get hired at some other agency, which we know is a problem.
Mm. So I want to ask you, this week the coroner's report came out about what the coroner said killed George Floyd, and said he did not die from asphyxiation, but rather underlying medical illnesses. And so obviously this helps Derek Chauvin's defense team. Are we going to see a conviction in this case. Um, I know Minneapolis had tried Muhammad Noor a couple years ago for an instance different to this, but um,
Yeah, after he shot the Australian woman who had called the
right,
police, and
yeah,
he was tried and convicted.
right, exactly. But um, it's it's rare to convict police officers because the system around it, around police officers, does protect them a lot of times, as you said, qualified immunity. So, are we going to see? Is it likely that Derek Chauvin could be convicted or walk free?
Yeah, so I haven't seen the coroner's report released yet. What I saw, and it's entirely possible that it's out, and I just haven't found it yet. What I have seen was the criminal complaint that the prosecutor filed, which
Mhm.
references an early, maybe preliminary version
Yeah,
of the
that's what
coroner.
I'm talking about. I haven't seen the full
Yeah.
report.
Okay. Um, until we see the full report, I'm not sure what's in it. Obviously, it does say that there were no signs of asphyxiation or strangulation, although the report uses the phrase traumatic asphyxiation, and I'm not entirely sure uh, whether that has a defined meaning that I'm just not aware of because I'm not a doctor. Um, it does say that it seems likely that the officer's actions contributed along with other factors, including Mr. Floyd's pre-existing medical issues. And I believe the complaint says potential intoxicants or something like that
Yeah.
um, to Mr. Floyd's death. The short legal answer is for a homicide conviction, the defendant here, Officer Derek Chauvin, needs to have caused the death. He doesn't have to be the only cause of death, but he does have to have caused the death. And legally, we use something called the but-for test. If we took Derek Chauvin's actions away, right? If Mr. Floyd was not in the position that he was in, would he still be alive? That is, would he be alive but for the officer's actions? If the answer to that question is yes, then I think there's a pretty firm grounding, a pretty solid basis for arguing that there can be homicide liability here, that he can be criminally punished. But that is going to be one of the points of contention. I fully expect the defense to say that the officer either did not cause the death or played a very, very minor role in his death. And if that's the case, it's that would prevent homicide liability. Part of what makes this really difficult is, in order to convict, the jury has to not only conclude that Derek Chauvin did cause his death, but that he did so, that there's evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that he did so. So all the defense has to do is raise a reasonable doubt about whether the officer contributed to or caused his death, right? That can be very difficult. That can be difficult for a variety of reasons, not just the legal standard, but also just as a pragmatic matter. Jurors often don't like believing that of officers. And also, even if jurors believe that he killed Mr. Floyd, there's also what's called mens rea in criminal law. That is the mindset that you have to have. Jurors don't like concluding beyond a reasonable doubt that an officer either intentionally and maliciously killed someone or was indifferent to someone, to someone's death, and that reluctance on behalf of jurors can make it very difficult to get conviction. So we did see Muhammad Noor convicted, but we also saw Michael Slager, the officer who shot Walter Scott as he ran away in South Carolina, where I live. We saw him get a hung jury, not get convicted at the state on the state charges, right? I think we need to be very careful about viewing conviction, about putting conviction up on a pedestal and making it the hallmark of success. Uh, I think the officer's actions in this case were criminal. I would be very happy to see them prosecuted and convicted. However, If they aren't, that doesn't mean that what they did is correct. It doesn't mean that we as a society approve of their actions or that their actions were even lawful. What it means is at least one juror had at least one reasonable doubt about whether they should be convicted. And conviction is a very visible thing. It's a very visceral thing. It's a very important thing that a lot of people view as a necessary part of community healing and closure. But I think that's a dangerous road to tread, not because the officer may not deserve conviction, but just because we know how difficult it is to get one.
Mm-hmm.
So do I think we'll see him convicted? I wish I had a better prediction for you, you know, maybe. I think there's a good chance in a case like this, there's a good chance that there'll be a plea deal because the video is so damning. On the other hand, given the reluctance of jurors to convict officers, I think we may see this play out in court. So I don't know.
So having, studied this issue for years and years, and then being a police officer yourself, I have to ask you,
former, I'm no longer, but
right,
I
former
was,
police officer, yes. But having watched everything that's happened this week, widespread protests, just real, there seems to be no trust in certain communities. Are you hopeful for the future around police community relations around the country? Obviously, there are communities that have worked really hard to create good relationships with their law enforcement officials, but that's not what we see on the news every night.
Yeah.
So because we are it's such a divisive time in our politics, everything is interwoven and placed together. But having studied this yourself, what do you kind of see as the future?
I am cautiously optimistic about the long-term future of policing and police community interactions and relations. But when I say long-term, what I mean is 20 to 50 years. Policing has changed a lot as an industry since the mid-1800s, where it really got its toehold in the United States. And you would not recognize today, we would not recognize what happened in the 1800s or the early 1900s as policing. And we wouldn't recognize, and in fact, we would condemn a lot of what happened in the civil rights era, right, in the 1960s or 70s as policing. So policing as an industry has changed, it has evolved, and largely it's done that for the better. But unfortunately, that evolution and that improvement is like 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. I think we've made progress even in the last 5 years since the summer of Walter Scott and Tamir Rice and Michael Brown in Ferguson. We've had our 3 steps forward, but now we're in our 2 steps back. That staggered pace of reform is infuriatingly predictable because agencies either won't or can't do what we know they need to do. Elected officials either won't or can't do what we know they need to do to provide more long-term solutions. So what we get are incremental, piecemeal fixes, and they don't ultimately solve anything. They make the situation a little bit more, a little bit better than it was. I do think that we are seeing in the last 5 years, I do think that we have seen more sustained public pressure on policing, more attention to policing than we have maybe at any point in history. Certainly, it's been more sustained than other incidents I can think of. Amadou Diallo's shooting in the late 90s or Rodney King's beating in the early 90s. And that is driving change. We see more bipartisan political support for getting rid of qualified immunity now than we ever have, for example, right? So I am cautiously optimistic, but I do not think that this is something that we as a society can really make meaningful inroads on in a year or 2 years or even 5 years. I think this has to be a generational thing. And the only way to get where we want it to be, the only way to keep moving forward to where we want it to be, is if members of the public keep paying attention and demand continued progress.
All right. Well, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for having me. I appreciated this.